Now, and good. Session is recording, so welcome to the 2018 HIC and PIT question and answer session. Please note that a more detailed webinar presentation has already been posted on the PIT and HIC landing page on the HUD Exchange. So today's session will be focused primarily on responding to any questions you might have that are related to the HIC and PIT data collection. A couple of logistics. The event is being re-recorded. You may be hearing the audio either through your computer speakers or your phone today, but make sure you choose only one audio source. If you're hearing my voice through both the phone and your computer, it's probably best to either hang up your phone or mute your computer so that you don't have any feedback. And you will be muted for the duration of today's event. Just a couple of housekeeping items. So let's review the page layout to help you get the most out of the webinar features. You have two options for communicating with us. There's the Q&A box and the chat box. You'll see in the upper right-hand corner of your screen both the blue chat box and the blue Q&A box. In order to use those boxes, just click on them and you'll see them sort of pop up on the right-hand bottom of your screen. If you have general comments, please post those in the public chat box and keep your comments and discussion related to the presentation. If you have questions, however, please post your questions in the Q&A box. We might miss it if it's in the chat box. So at this point, we have three presenters, William Snow with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, Megan Henry with Apt Associates, and myself, Tracy Dialano with Apt Associates. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to William now for some general comments and to get started with the Q&A session. So, William?
All right. Thanks, Tracy. Excited for this call today. I like the Q&A format. As Tracy said, we're not going to go over all the stuff in the notice. Hopefully you've read it by now. If not, that's a little concerning. So if you're unclear what changes happened for 2018, please read that notice. Last time when we did the webinar, we had some technical issues. We apologize for that. We are doing this today so that you will get a chance to ask your questions. At this point, I assume that most communities are done with their planning, so to speak. They know where they're counting. They have an idea of their locations. They are working on volunteer engagements. They're probably starting to train in some areas. So this is a great opportunity to ask those fun questions where you're not sure what to do in certain circumstances. We will actually go over even a few of the common questions and then open it up through the Q&A box to address other questions. Next slide, please. All right, I think, let's see, who's going to lead out on this? Is this going to be you, Tracy, or Megan on asking the questions?
Okay, so William, it's Tracy, and I'm going to ask a couple of HIC questions. And the first one is really related to RRH, or Rapid Rehousing Projects on the HIC. And the question is very, very simple. How do you count RRH projects on the HIC?
Awesome. So I should start with counting rapid rehousing at a point in time is tricky. We know that. In fact, it won't ever be perfect, right? A lot of times rapid rehousing is based on a set of vouchers you're going to get over the course of a year or over the course of the term of a grant that you have. So doing it at a point in time is never going to be perfect, never going to be great. So we came up with a methodology that more or less tells us what's going on that night. How are your rapid rehousing units being used? So the way that we kind of devised how you could come to that conclusion is figure out those who are actively enrolled on the night of the count, who are in a rapid rehousing project, even if they're only receiving services. So that's our starting point, right? Look at participants in rapid rehousing projects who are actively enrolled, and then look at whether or not there's a move-in date using the HMIS data element 4.17, right? Do they have a residential move-in date? Those are your two core criteria. we recognize that the HIC, because we're really not talking about the PIT, right? This is the HIC because they're permanent housing projects. The HIC is used not just to report to HUD. You guys use it for all sorts of purposes. So if you have a rapid rehousing project with no persons on that night, you can still enter that rapid rehousing project on your HIC and just put 0 beds and 0 units. That's more for your purpose of knowing you have that and kind of logging that you have an active rapid rehousing project even though no one is there on that night. So that is how you record your rapid rehousing beds and units in the housing inventory count.
Great, thanks. So the next one is always a tricky one, William, and this is on the RHY programs. So the question is, there are 3 RHY programs within our continuum of care: a basic center program, a transitional living program, and a maternity group home. Now, these programs do not verify or screen for homeless status. Should they be included in the HIC?
Yeah, that is a really good question. So the short answer is generally yes. So the RHY programs, BCP, TLP, MGH, they are targeted to persons who are homeless. And their definition, the HHS definition, while it's a little broader, we, for the purposes of counting inventory, are happy to include all of the beds for BCP, TLP, and MGH on the HIC, except where there are beds set aside in the inventory for those who are foster care or juvenile justice. So we know that there are some programs that, you know, they have a 15-bed project. 5 of those beds are always for wards of the state, whether they be foster care or juvenile justice, but the other 10 are for anyone who meets the HHS definition of homeless, even if it's more expansive than HUD's definition. Include, in that example, all 10 of those beds and the persons who are sleeping in those beds for the housing inventory, and the persons would be counted in the sheltered point in time count. So yes, we know that captures a little bit of a broader audience. This is not unprecedented. If you think about our transitional housing programs, HUD-funded transitional housing, often, well, among the eligibility allowances are those who are at risk, so we even do that for our own. So this is not unusual, and we feel it is very important to have an understanding of what inventory is out there for our homeless youth. So count them, even if they have a broader definition of homeless, unless there is a set aside of beds specifically for foster care and juvenile justice or juvenile justice.
Okay, great. So now I'm going to actually turn it back over to Megan to ask you a couple of frequently asked point time questions.
Okay. So the first one is a question we get quite a bit during the data submission and cleaning process, and it's how do you count the people in couples without children when one person is age 25 and older and the other person is 18 to 24?
Yes, this is definitely a fun one. We get it often. So the way that our data is structured, you probably have all noticed this, we don't count families or non-families or couples, or we focus primarily on what is the household composition, and it's generally focused on age groupings, right? Do you have people in a household who are under 18, and are there people in a household who are over 18? That's kind of the core of our data collection mechanisms, right? So what that ends up doing is it makes us blind to couples. So in a scenario like this, you will enter you'll enter 2 separate individuals, and in the age categories, you'll put them in the right category, right? If you have someone over age 25, that person will be counted in a household without children over the age of 25. If you had somebody who was 18 to 24, you would count that person in the household without children in the 18 to 24 category. The three household groupings, right? Households with at least one adult and one child, households with only children, and households without children are, if you combine those, you get the full universe that you have in the CoC. We also have a couple of other reporting categories that are duplicate. So the unaccompanied youth subcategory, those are youth that would be counted in one of the respective household categories, as well as in the unaccompanied youth subcategory. So the 18 to 24-year-old youth would be counted in two places, maybe more, but for our purposes here, in two places, in the households without children category for 18 to 24 age group, as well as the unaccompanied youth category for 18 to 24 as well. So it gets a little fun when we throw in the other subcategories beyond the core household groups. So it means that somebody can be recorded in multiple places, but those three core household groups should never have duplication. I think that answers it. Megan, does that answer it fully?
It does. Can you go back to that slide one more time? So one other sort of question that we get is when a couple is, say, age 17 and 18, how would you report that coupling?
Age 17 and 18. You take it by their age groups. So you have the 17-year-old would be in a, if it's a couple, right? If it's a couple, typically we'll report them as individuals, kind of what we said here on the slide for the initial answer. We still treat them as individuals, and we would report the 18-year-old in the households without children as an individual 18-year-old, and then we would treat the 17-year-old as the households with only children as an unaccompanied. So that definitely gets tricky.
Okay, and they both would go into the unaccompanied youth subcategory in their own age group. Okay.
Yes.
Great. Okay. Can we move to the next slide? Why did HUD change the definition or the data collection requirements for survivors of domestic violence?
Awesome. So this is really important to us. The domestic violence, survivors of domestic violence, we want to make sure we're doing the most we can to balance the importance of identifying them and maintaining safety, confidentiality, and security for them. So historically, we have made the requirement to identify persons survivors of domestic violence. We made that optional in the PIT count. We haven't changed that. That's still optional. And that's partly to recognize that some communities still struggle with how do you collect that information in a safe and secure way. We're actually hoping to release next week some guidance on collecting data on survivors of domestic violence in the context of the PIT count. The guidance will focus on the counting itself as opposed to planning, because you guys are way beyond planning at this point, but it'll focus on kind of ideas around safety there. But we were finding that we don't know what data we have, even with those, with the data that's been submitted by CoCs, because there's really two broad categories of data that we're getting with domestic violence. People are either reporting on, has a person been survived domestic violence ever, or are they currently fleeing a domestic violence situation and they're homeless because of that. So because we have not been clear in the past, we don't know what we have. So this year we decided we wanted to clarify that. It's not to say that one thing has different or better value over the other. Both of those are actually extremely valuable pieces of information. We decided that it was more helpful in the short term, at least, for us to know those who are homeless because they are currently fleeing. So this is just a way for us to get an understanding of people on the street counted who are experiencing domestic violence now, more or less, or fleeing because of domestic violence. We would encourage you to consider asking the broader question, have you ever experienced a form of domestic violence? That's something that is certainly good to ask, but you certainly need to weigh in the balancing game of what's too many questions asked in the PIT count, and do we even know how to ask this question in a sensitive way? And so I would just say there's lots to consider there, and for us, we decided that currently fleeing was the more valuable piece, at least in the short term.
Okay, great. Thanks. Okay, so the next couple of questions are about methodology. And a question that we got fairly frequently was, can we expand our PIT count methodology to include phone and web-based survey options?
All right. I'm actually going to combine this with that next question there that's on the screen, the exceptions to face-to-face. They kind of go hand in hand. So phone and web-based, generally no. You need to actually see the people. You need to identify that they're homeless. You need to know who you're counting. Are there exceptions to this? Yes. So I'm going to, again, kind of mix all this together. If you have a street outreach team and you have a by name list, for example, and you know from your by name list that you didn't identify 3 people. They weren't counted on the PIT count. You don't know why. You had the identification variable so you could see, yeah, these people we didn't find. You can have your street outreach worker contact those 3 different households and ask them where they slept on the night of the point-in-time count. Technically, that would be a phone. You actually could do it in person. That's acceptable. You can do that as long as you're tagging it to that night, right? You need to verify that those people on that list were homeless on the night your COC designated as the PIT count. That is one way using a phone is okay. Another way that we've seen using a phone is okay is when people call into coordinated entry, maybe it's a 211, which is pretty common, and they are seeking services, and there is enough depth in the 211 interaction to understand that person's homeless status on that night, you can use that information. And then one other one I'll put out there is we are happy to work closer with some of our other partners, federal and otherwise, but the most obvious one is schools. So we have schools, some of them across the country now, who are engaging in the PIT count by using their liaisons to follow up, sometimes via text, sometimes via phone call, with people on their education list who are identified as homeless to figure out on the night of the PIT count, were they still homeless and whether or not that met our definition. That actually, it's a lot of words that I'm sharing, but it can be a very short interaction and give you just the information you need to find out, were they literally homeless on the night of the count. That's another thing that we've seen is helpful. That's hard to do. The de-identification piece can be hard on that, but we've seen some communities use that strategy with their willing school liaisons, and that's been good. Those are the categories of when I think of phone-based, that's okay. What's not okay is just having a general PIT count phone number people can call into. That's not okay. It leaves way too much open. And I can't think of other phone options that we would allow. So let me move to web-based. Web-based can be okay in kind of similar to the phone. If you are using a mobile application, that's either a downloadable app or a web-based application, your communities may very well be doing almost all of their counts via web-based survey, right, where they go and interact, do their count like normal, but they use a web-based application to do it. As part of that process, maybe volunteers are carrying tablets. It is okay to have a web-based tablet or a web-based application on a tablet and to engage somebody on the street and even to hand that person the tablet and let them answer the questions. That also is kind of meeting the web-based survey principle. But there is an interaction there where the volunteer is seeing them, identifying that they at least were out on the night of the count, and letting that person respond to questions that clarify their homeless status. What is not okay is like a Facebook type survey, enter your information if you were homeless. That just leaves way too much out there, and there are other forms and variations on that, right? Like a Survey Monkey if you can't see the people you're interacting with, or if you don't know them, again, you could use your street outreach workers in a similar way you did with maybe the phone follow-up if they are better with a web-based application or a text, that's fine. But that's rare, right? So generally, web-based applications are a no, or surveys. You generally have to be in their presence, or the volunteer has to be in their presence administering the survey. So hopefully that wasn't too wordy for you. Megan, is there something I missed on that one, or more clarification that may be needed?
No, I think that was helpful.
Cool.
I think that's all we had in the prepared frequently asked questions. I think at this point we should allow some of the participants to get their questions asked. So Tracy, did you want to assist in that?
Sure. Sure. We'll start it out, and we can just sort of take turns and chime in as needed. So, William, the first one is, we've got a lot of good questions coming in, so let's just start from the top and work our way down. So the question is, earlier this year, HUD floated the idea of merging the System Performance Measurement Review period with the HIC and PIT. Is this still a possibility, or can we presume a similar timeline as in years past for the HIC, PIT, this PM data collection period, mid-March to April?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I will tell you the most firm sets of dates that exist are actually the HIC and PIT submission. I don't see a scenario except in rare extension periods because of technical failures where we would go past May 1. Our target is always around April 30th for the PIT count. That gives you at the community level enough time to clean the data, or sometimes it's challenging to even make it by then, so we would have a hard time setting an earlier deadline. But we can't go too much later because it impacts the competitions, and we're hoping to be on a schedule where the competitions are open in the summer. So that kind of tells you the HIC and PIT timeline. For the system performance, that's the one we're struggling with. We've had a few different thoughts about where we're going to land with opening the system performance. We would like to have that data submitted as well by the time that you go into the NOFA. So we're looking at opening that period around the same time as the PIT, maybe having it open through the month of May so that it's available. We have not come to a decision that we've finalized or published for you all, but just to kind of have your thinking on that, or our thinking on that, we'd like to make that earlier. We're looking at our 3 core data submission requirements are the AHAR, which happens, into the first week of December usually. Then you have the PIT count, which is you do the PIT at the end of January, the data is due by the end of April. And then the system performance, it follows the same AHAR timeline in terms of the what data period you're reporting on, and we're debating about, is there an optimal time for us to be able to collect the data? Do we start collecting in January 1, and just open the window until April? So I will tell you there's lots of things on the table there. We're trying to figure out what's best for communities. But keep your eyes open. We'll likely have you submit your system performance data by the end of May this year, and hopefully we'll have the window open longer so that you have plenty of time to kind of balance the data submission requirements between HIC, PIT, and system performance measures.
Okay, thanks, William. And Megan, if it's okay, I'm going to go ahead and do this one, and then I'll help William out if he needs it. This one, the next question is on the severe weather emergency shelter. And the question is, how are these included in the HIC? It's not a year-round emergency shelter. It's not a seasonal emergency shelter. So severe weather shelter, how do you count them if there are no clients because severe weather was not called for on the night of the PIT?
Yep, we count these as our overflow voucher segments, and they simply aren't counted if the severe weather isn't hit. That's just the current standard we have. Obviously, the seasonal falls under the seasonal category, so they'll be counted based on the weather. We actually have this every year. We have some fluctuation within there. I will tell you when it comes to things like our competition. Historically, when we look at things like HMIS bed coverage rates, we tend to focus on the year-round inventory only so as to avoid any complications that may arise with either seasonal shelters or ad hoc. That's certainly subject to every year's NOFA, but historically, that's how we've treated the emergency shelter information. And again, overflow beds, which we're counting these severe weather shelters as overflow, are not counted if no one is in there on the night of the count.
Great. So treat them as overflow beds and report the number of overflow beds that were occupied on the night of the inventory count. Okay, Megan, you want to take the next one?
Sure. So the next one is about collecting information on demographic characteristics of people during the unsheltered count. And the question is, for unsheltered persons, does HUD have a preferred protocol or standard for determining a person's gender, race, or ethnicity if the person is unable or unwilling to answer the questions? And it goes on to ask, is it appropriate for the enumerator to select? And my guess is they ran out of space and meant to ask if it's appropriate for the enumerator to select the characteristics based on observations.
This is a great question. This is a tough one, and it depends a little bit on how your CoC has decided to move forward, right? So CoCs have some discretion here. Some CoCs have chosen to mix the interview-based surveys with an observation-based, so they're essentially going out and counting everyone, right? They're doing their full count. But they have, and they generally, many communities are at the point where they're doing an interview-based survey or count, but there's always a case where somebody either refuses to be counted or you can't wake them up or you shouldn't wake them up, right? But you can see them. Your community can implement a policy that allows you to tally those people you observed on the night of the count. And the CoC has the discretion to determine whether and how far to take this. HUD has not set a standard per se on should you take a guess. I would say there are certain things that would be almost impossible to guess. Ethnicity is a very tough one. We think that it might be easy, but it's often not terribly easy. Gender can be easier, but I'd caution a little bit there. It's not always as clear as we think. But the CoC can implement a policy there about if you have an observation, whether or not to attempt to collect based on observations or the observer's observation, or to leave it blank and deal with it in the extrapolation. So the extrapolation is the key for all of this. You certainly should be relying on some extrapolation. I can't imagine a single count that's not going to have some missing or refused data. We've published an extrapolation tool precisely to help you with demographics. I highly recommend it. It's very good. It also kind of flags if you have a lot of information about the people you're counting, right? Most people are responding, then I definitely would encourage you to use that tool. We look at kind of an 80% threshold. So if you have 80% response in the various categories, yeah, don't try to fill it in. It's actually safer to leave it alone and allow the extrapolation to run its course. But a lot of times 80% is a hard mark to meet, and you won't know if you have 80% until after the count. So that's a hard one to do. You'd have to look historically at what your CoC counts. So I would say all CoCs should count on using some form of extrapolation to deal with their missing data. And again, if you don't have that problem, if you have all your data, that's fantastic, although it seems tough. But HUD does not have a standard beyond that. Tracy and Megan, have you had more experience with that you think would be helpful to share?
Well, we do ordinarily every year help some communities extrapolate their demographic characteristics. It's really hard to get a full accounting of everybody's demographics for the unsheltered count. There is a PIT extrapolation tool, which you mentioned, which is very helpful, but it is certainly something that we can help communities do. when it comes time for submission.
Great.
Okay, well, the next question is very timely, and while it's specific to Hurricane Maria, I mean, last year we did have 2 hurricanes. There's all the fires in California, so it could even be taken more broadly. But the question is about Hurricane Maria evacuees. This is a 2-part question. The first part is, do we count those in our state in a hotel being paid for by FEMA? If so, are there any best practices for working with FEMA to get an accurate count?
That is a great question. So our heart actually goes out to all of you. There were so many disasters this year. I mean, it is very sad. So a lot of us are dealing with that, and it's unfortunate. So I will say our first and foremost, the most important thing is to take care of our people who don't have housing. We prioritize that over getting your best count and everything else. Serve these people. That may mean, and we've seen this in communities, you may need a waiver or an exception to the point-in-time count date. You may need to count later. We have a few communities in California in particular and other places who have asked, we don't think we're ready yet to do a count, and we won't be ready in January. Can we do it in February? We generally grant these exceptions. So if you are one of those communities that has been impacted, you should consider that. Look at, your volunteer base as well. Look at what it takes to do that. You will still need to submit by April 30th or around that period. It's very difficult for us to waive, but you can have an extension or an exception to the date. So I want to start with that. Now let's move to the actual question. On our housing inventory, you have a way to demarcate if a bed is a disaster bed. That generally means a bed paid for by FEMA. There are some states, Texas actually in particular, does some of their own disaster stuff. I think most states actually do something. You could include that. So it's not limited to FEMA, but it is primarily FEMA-funded beds that are for evacuees. You should try to get that information and should include it on the HIC, but when you put it in that category of disaster bed, what we end up doing on our end is we try, or at least historically we've tried to do this, we try to adjust for that when we look at competition stuff. We did that in 17 because we recognize that's not your normal inventory. So I just want to state that because you should have some comfort. You might be afraid your emergency shelter numbers just went through the roof because of this disaster and it's going to drastically impact you. We want to understand what is associated with a disaster in terms of your inventory and what is not, and adjust accordingly. And we adjust through the HIC and the point-in-time shelter data as well. So I want to lay that out there. We generally would like those beds captured, but that's not always possible. And that goes to the question about are there best practices. We actually have had a mix of success on this one, partly tied to the state you're in and the coordination between the state and the federal side about how much information you get about your FEMA and disaster beds. So we'd encourage you to try to get the information, especially if you're already in contact with FEMA or the state and you're discussing inventory. Yes, include that. There are some cases where you're out of the loop. People are not giving you any information. You don't have access to it. You've tried and it's not happening. We are not going to ding you for not having that. If it doesn't happen and you just can't make it happen, that's fine. You can leave it off. That is okay. But we'd encourage you to try to get that information, less because we want to complete HIC, more because we want you to be in touch with the right people and be aware of the resources going on. That's our primary concern there. I actually asked Tracy and Megan if you have seen more best practices. I am not looped into a lot of that. I just know that the contact with the state often actually makes a huge difference, and whether or not that coordination is happening on the national kind of FEMA side with the state people and then with the CoC. So Megan,
Boy. You know, usually if the state is helping, usually the state has like a division of housing or something like that that is working with FEMA, and they may have and probably do have some kind of a database that they're using to track where folks are. So I would contact whether it's the State Division of Housing or the Housing Finance Authority that sort of worked with FEMA. They may have a database that they can help you work on to at least get sort of a count. So the big deal is, however, if you're going to record your disaster-related beds, make sure that you don't mix those beds with your other projects when you report them in the HIC. Create separate projects for your disaster-related beds, and make sure that you click the these are disaster-related beds box so that HUD can sort of separate those out from your overall total count. And I don't know, Megan, if you have other ideas of how to work with FEMA to get the accurate count.
No, your suggestion sounds good to me.
Okay. Megan, you want to take the next one, and I'll slide back here to the RRH slide so we can all look at it.
Okay. So, William, the next question is related to rapid rehousing. Does actively enrolled in rapid rehousing refer to entry date to exit date and not only those households that have move-in dates? So what is the definition of actively enrolled in rapid rehousing?
Yes, the definition stated on there is correct. It's about your entry and exit dates, not your move-in dates. And are they entered there? So active for our purposes here is the night of the point in time count. So are they enrolled, again, not necessarily a move-in date, for that first element, I should say. Are they actively enrolled on the night of the point in time count? Obviously, we have that second element, right, to count them on the HIC. They also need to have a move-in date, so they need both of those factors. But for the purposes of actively enrolled, it is just are they in the program according to your records.
Great, thanks. That makes sense. So the next question is something that, what are some tips for counting people who are being housed in motels that are paid for by a social service agency?
Oh, that's a tough one. I'm blanking on what our definition exactly says because it actually covers the very circumstance of when the hotel circumstance should be counted. And I have the notice up, so I'll flip through it while we go here.
Okay.
You don't count everybody who is in a hotel motel. It says in the definition, hotels and motels paid for by charitable organizations or by federal, state, or local governments for low-income individuals. So you could count them. The only way really to do it, or you should count them, the only way really to do it is to have that interaction with the agency. There's no magic bullets for this one. It's actually the same if you expand your question to include the faith-based, or you expand it to include some of the other circumstances, other forms. Faith-based is a very common one. It's really hard to get it unless you have that active discussion with the faith-based provider. I will say that at times you may know the number of people who are in a facility. Maybe the provider has said, look, we house 20 people, but you may get nothing beyond that, right? You may have zero idea about demographics and subpopulations, and you may have none of that. You're going to have to use extrapolation to get to that, and the extrapolation tool focuses more on the demographic side, but you'll have to use demographic or extrapolation to get at the other pieces as well. Tracy, were you going to add something there?
Sure. Yeah. You know, in the years that I was working on our point in time count here, What we would do is for those social service agencies or those faith-based agencies that had programs where they were helping people and housing them in hotels and motels, we just had them participate as an active agency in our point-in-time count, and we provided them with training. We gave them all of the surveys, and our expectation was that they would have their participants complete the survey, and then they would give us the survey back. So it was much more starting out very, very early, finding out your social service agencies, advertising it, training them, having them participate in the count rather than sort of going to them and asking them for a count. We had them actually conduct the interviews with the people they were serving, and it just became, you know, a really big community response where all of our agencies, faith-based or otherwise, wanted to participate in the count and help gather that information. So that would be my recommendation, is to get them to participate with you. Okay. Megan, any other ideas from your end?
No, I think that sounds good to me. Working with the social service agency certainly is the best way to go.
Okay, so the next one is a question about HOPWA, and I'm not HOPWA, but I'm not really sure what the question is. It just says, what about HOPWA?
So let me try to answer that. So HOPWA obviously has several different, there are variations on what's funded in HOPWA. If you look in the notice, or you could look in the data elements in 2.6 in the HMIS data dictionary, HOPWA has 4 programs listed out. In our notice, we talk about how we treat those programs. So my encouragement there is go to the funding source piece, figure out the funding source, and then you'll know how to treat them in the housing inventory or the point-in-time count. Because while the HOPWA unit should be included in the housing inventory, some of them are permanent housing. That means some of the people associated with the projects may or may not be in the point-in-time count, depending on whether or not the project is classified as permanent housing. So first identify the nature of the program. That should already be in HMIS. And once you have that, then you'll know how to treat them on the HIC and PIT respectively.
And William, a related question asks whether we should include HOPWA rental assistance beds, which are not dedicated to homelessness, on the HIC.
Yeah, that's a good one. So we have followed the similar concept as we said with the RI beds earlier. Typically, as long as there's no unique carve-out or special designation that says these have to go to people that definitely don't meet our definition, if they simply can serve others, we have said include the beds, and that way we have the inventory and we can kind of go from there. But yes, typically include the beds unless there's a clear set aside somehow saying that these people are not the same as who we want to collect in the PIT count.
Okay, so let me go ahead and ask the next question. We're Megan, and she keeps losing access because she's in the midst of this horrible storm. So I'll just keep moving in, and then Megan can chime in if she's able to hook back in. So the next question, William, is on RHY and the HIC again. And the problem for them in this area is that generally all of the beds by their local RHY provider are being used by foster or juvenile justice clients, and in fact, in the last 7 years, they've never actually identified a homeless client during the PIC and HIC contacts. So for that particular RHY program, what would you recommend, that they just not include it on the HIC, or what do you think?
Yeah, that's a tough one. So this is where we allow some discretion at the local level to figure out what to do. In this case, if it were me, I would go talk to the right provider and understand a little more about the nature of the program. Maybe this is their policy, so maybe they haven't stated that these beds are set aside, but they are operating under a policy or program model that targets to those groups. In that case, whether it's a formal set-aside or not, it's still a set-aside, and it is okay not to include them. I think the key here is having this communication with the right provider so they don't feel you are excluding them because it makes you look bad or because they're a youth provider, right? We want to avoid the misperception that we are taking off units because we don't want them on there, right? We just don't want them. So I would have the conversation with them. And if that is how they operate and they understand why you plan on excluding it because they don't really serve people who are homeless and they don't really plan on it, then it seems like that's just fine to exclude it. But you're kind of making that decision in partnership with the right provider rather than kind of looking and just making the call on your own. So that's my encouragement. Sometimes that partnership or discussion simply won't be possible. It sounds like if you know this much about the provider, you probably are able to have that conversation.
Okay, great. So let's go ahead and move on here to couples and the PIT. So when you treat a couple as individuals, does that mean that they are two households rather than one household?
Yeah, good question. Technically, in the PIT, yes, they show up as two households.
Yep, I know it's a little strange, but yep.
Yeah, and I will say part of this gets at this concept of families, right? You'll notice we don't really use the term families in our data collection because we want to respect the fact that people define families in so many different ways. And this partly gets at the couple concept, right? Couples are families to some and not to others, right, depending on how they self-identify. And a couple today may not be a couple tomorrow, so to avoid any confusion there, we simply look at this household grouping that kind of impacts or is impacted by that. Are you partnered with children or not principle? So it's not to say we don't ever care about couples and we don't believe couples exist. We know that they do. We actually added data elements in the last couple of years to help us understand relationships better, so we certainly encourage communities to look at couples, but there are too many confounding factors when you try to touch on every variation of household configuration, so we just limit ourselves to the three.
Okay, great. So the next one is also a PIT question, and Megan, always feel free to chime in if you're able. But the question is, if it's a household with children of a 25-year-old, a 23-year-old, and their 1-year-old child, those are in the households with children 25 and older, is that correct?
Yeah, so Tracy, you'll have to remind me. I believe our standard, because we've debated this one back and forth, is go with the older parent, in this case, or guardian, and associate them with that household. So for this case, we decided to put them in the households with at least one adult and one child category. Is that right,
yes,
Tracy?
That is correct.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, otherwise you'd be trying to split up a whole bunch of different families that were just younger. So go with the oldest person. If they're over 24, then they go into the regular households with one adult and one child.
Yeah, and we recognize this is one of those cases. The reason we went back and forth is there's no perfect answer to it, right? Because one way or the other, we're going to have to make a decision, and somebody's going to get counted in, quote unquote, the wrong category. So we just thought, well, we're going to set a standard, and the standard was go with the older parent or guardian.
And let's further clarify this definition. So we have another question about households without children. If one person is 40 and they're with their 20-year-old son, is that 20-year-old son considered an accompanied youth or an unaccompanied youth?
They're with a 40-year-old parent?
Yes.
Accompanied.
So that 20-year-old would not be included in the unaccompanied youth.
Yeah. Yes, for the purposes of the unaccompanied youth, although this is the weird case where they would show up in the households households without children on their own, right? They won't; those two won't show up as a household for that larger category, but for the purposes of the unaccompanied youth data, they won't show up. They won't be reported in the unaccompanied youth subcategory.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, those are the variations that give us big headaches and lots of internal discussion because, again, it's tough, and those situations exist. So it's a good question.
Yeah, it is a good question. It does get a little confusing. Okay, so for rapid rehousing, HUD guidance this year says for a project to be included, it has to provide rental assistance. Is this different than last year? We have some service-only rapid rehousing, and we don't count that project on the HIC, correct?
Maybe I'm confused about this question.
Yeah.
I think I am confused because I think even last year, our standard in the notice was the persons can be receiving supportive services only, and we call out that language in the notice. So I'm not sure what's being asked exactly. Can you go to the slide on that because it has the notice language? I believe it was.
It does.
Yeah. That number 1, it says, including persons who are only receiving supportive services in the rapid rehousing project. So no, rental assistance is not a requirement. And that's partly because we recognize rental assistance or the housing can come from many different sources. And sometimes the housing comes, or the assistance comes through something like a security deposit or a variation on service. So we decided to be a little more inclusive and broaden it to the supportive service allowance, not just limiting to rental assistance.
Okay. Let's see. The question is a domestic violence question, William, and it's, will you provide a webinar on domestic violence requirements for the PIT?
Yeah, we went back and forth on that. For this year, no. It's partly because of timing. I'm already concerned that we're going to put out some supplemental documents next week because we're in January. It feels really late to be providing you guys anything. We're even doing this Q&A, although I'm hoping most of you have done your planning by now, and we're kind of helping smooth out some of the gray areas with this call. But we're going to avoid doing that just because of timing. We work with a group we call our DVTA Consortium. They're a fantastic set of technical assistance providers, including some researchers and people who are in the field working on domestic violence issues every day. We are working with them this year to do this, this supplemental guidance, and I've spoken with them about possibly doing more next year around planning for the PIT count, engaging the domestic violence providers more and stakeholders. So we likely will provide more in the future. That's what we're anticipating. A webinar is possible. We haven't kind of thought through all the products that you'll get, but we recognize it's one of those areas where we have not provided a whole lot of information, and we think it's important. Again, if you can do it in a confidential and safe way, you should try to get this information. We need better information about those experiencing domestic violence, but we certainly will not do that at the expense of their safety and security. So, yes, we will provide more. I don't know if it'll be a webinar, though.
Okay. So let's move on to another FEMA question. And this one is, should our community coordinate with FEMA to count people displaced by disaster that are still staying in hotels locally, even though our community was within a declared disaster zone? And are they included on the PIT or just the HIC? It's a good question.
That is a good question, and it depends a little bit on the assistance. Generally, we include them in the PIT and HIC as temporary vouchers, and that's where you can have that designation, the natural disaster designation. I would say as long as you have any FEMA beds, associated with a disaster, whether it happened that year or it happened years ago. If you are still receiving the assistance there, or you have people receiving the assistance, you certainly can include them to the extent you have that information. We certainly would like to see it and that coordination. But generally, I think we count them as shelter, even though some of them are staying a rather long time. So I'll defer a little bit to Tracy on that one. I can't think of a circumstance where we haven't counted them as shelter, but it's possible that we've seen a couple different variations. Megan or Tracy?
I would say I think as long as they're still receiving FEMA assistance. You know, in other words, they're not still in a hotel, but now they're paying on their own. Okay.
Tracy, have we ever counted them anything other than emergency shelter, even if they've been there for 3 years?
No, it's always been emergency shelter.
Yeah, that's what I thought, even though it's kind of goes against our principle of short term, but yeah.
Yeah, if they're in a hotel or motel and still being paid for by FEMA, it goes underneath the hotel motel voucher assistance.
Yep.
Okay, so the next question is back to DV, and so for participants who refuse to have domestic violence written down in their paperwork anywhere, should we or how do we include these participants in the PIT count?
Yeah, good question. So this again gets at why we make collecting on domestic violence optional. You should collect on the people. If somebody is homeless, you can fulfill all of HUD's reporting requirements without submitting DV data. So count them as homeless if, in fact, they meet our definition. And again, we don't count Category 4 per se here. We're counting, are they on the streets or shelter? That's what we're looking at in the PIT count context. But if they don't want their DV status stated, or you're not clear, you should be very clear when collecting this information. They should know whether or not this is being reported, right? We don't want them to, we don't want to compromise anything here. So err on the side of caution. If you're not sure if they consented to give information about their domestic violence experience, I wouldn't provide it, but certainly include them on the count otherwise.
Okay, and this is the next question is also DV created, and I believe this is sort of where we get into that aggregate de-identified information. And the question here is there anything the DV community can do to assist the homeless service community with their PIT count? Probably in relationship to how do we get sort of a good count of persons who are homeless, but also victims of domestic violence.
Yeah, I mean, this goes to the same kind of areas, our faith-based and our VA providers and all of our providers, right? A lot of it is taking the time to build the relationships. We know, again, like some of the other providers, that some do not want anything to do with the count or the COC at times, and that's challenging. I have seen the opposite as well. We've seen some domestic violence providers step up very heavily and actually participate in the PIT count steering committees where they are an active player in making decisions around the point-in-time count. In fact, those have often been the most successful engagements with our DV providers is when they're not just peripherally invited, but when they are at the table helping to make decisions. Sometimes things can be difficult and you have to kind of work through the various data collection requirements, but that often creates a very productive conversation. So that's one best practice I would share with you is invite them to help lead out on the count, not just give you numbers, because I think they tend to be more willing to assist.
Yeah, and they have great ideas about how they can get you accurate information without having to compromise privacy and security information of their clients, and you know, even down to the point of creating sort of Excel spreadsheets that can be used as just aggregate information for them to add that to your PIT count. You don't need to know their names or their social security numbers. You just sort of need to know an aggregate count of persons with the different demographic information associated with it.
Yep.
Okay, so the next one, oh, here's a good one. Suppose I have a group of siblings, 3 youths under the age of 18, presenting as a household. If one of them is chronically homeless, is the whole group chronic? And does the minor head of household need to be the one who qualifies?
Oh, that's one of our favorites. Yes. If one qualifies, and that would be, in this case, it would have to be the minor head of household. That is a designation in the chronically homeless rule. You have to go by that head of household, the youth head of household. But if that youth is found to be chronically homeless, then the entire household would be counted as chronic.
Correct. Okay. Next one, do I understand correctly that an adult couple with no children would be counted in PIT as individuals in 2 separate households? If so, when would the number of households be different than the number of persons in the household with no children category?
Yep, so you are correct. They would be counted as 2 separate individuals and thus 2 separate households. Right now, actually, if you look at the household data collection, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, Tracy, we collect on households for the households without children, but I believe in our data collection tables, we don't collect for the households without children, and I'm kind of peeking as we go.
No, we collect the number of households for households without children. What we don't collect is the number of households for chronically homeless people in households without children.
Oh, that's what it was. You're right. We didn't go to the chronic side. Yes. So we do collect it on households. So yes. So basically, in the context of the PIT count, you're not going to know couples. It just won't give that information. What can you do? And maybe this is something we can consider, and I'll talk with Megan and Tracy afterwards about doing something different with number of households, because it feels like you could probably report the number of households separate than the number of persons, right? You could treat them as 2 individuals, as people, 2 separate people in the households without children, but allow them to report as a single household. We probably could do that, but I need to look at some of the implications a little further before a decision like that is made.
Okay, so that one we'll think about a little bit more, and if you could help us out, the person who submitted that question, if you would please put it into the HUD AAQ, that'll sort of prompt us to talk a little bit more about it. So appreciate you bringing up the question, and it would be helpful if you posted that question for us to come back to. Okay, does HUD recommend a standard HIC data collection tool, specifically for non-HMIS contributing organizations?
This is a tough one, and I may end up relying more on Megan and Tracy here. So as I've been talking with communities, especially talking with more rural communities in the past little while in balance of states, we are hearing more and more of the challenge of fulfilling the HIC requirement, even more challenging, sometimes much more challenging than the point-in-time requirement, and largely because of the non-HMIS participating. So we don't have a tool that we have published. I will say in the context of the AHAR, there is a tool that you can request. We're thinking about, and it's tied to the housing inventory, we're thinking about modifying that and making it available so that you can maintain it locally, and it essentially allows you to keep it updated throughout the year. It doesn't solve the problem of getting the data on the number of people served on the night of the count. So it would allow you to kind of have a running sense of the inventory in your area. You may be doing this anyways, likely tied to coordinated entry, but we haven't provided a tool per se. And we would love suggestions on this one because we, believe it or not, don't really want to cause a lot of pain for you guys. And if this is causing a lot of pain, we'd like to find a way to make it easier. So we are open to thoughts about that. Megan and Tracy, any thoughts you want to add?
You know, I do know that many communities have developed their own HIC data collection tool that are used for both HMIS and non-HMIS contributing organizations. So it's a great question, and it's probably something we ought to think about a little bit more.
And this is a case where if you have a recommendation, submitting it through the AAQ would be great. We will look at that. So we are open to suggestions. Or if you have a good tool in a community that you're willing to share, you can submit that to the AAQ or submit it to me directly. I'm always happy to receive those. So that's we're open to suggestions. We want to make this easier.
And sharing of information among CoCs is always encouraged.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next question is, will you provide an updated extrapolation tool with 2017 data standards gender updates as well as revised years tables?
Good question. I don't think we're doing that, partly because we ran out of time on it, so I apologize. We are updating the model surveys. I'm hoping those will go out in the next day, or not day or so, early next week is the hope for that. They're nearly done. I think with the extrapolation tool, the plan would be to release it earlier, well, I guess later this year, so it's available early for you for next year's count. But maybe I'm off. Megan or Tracy, did we end up updating that?
No, I don't think so. Oh, I don't know.
No, but I don't think it's the last year's tool. I don't think that's unusable, because I do think that the changes to the count were so minimal this year that I feel like you could still use the old tool.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think the main difference is the gender category, the gender category for those who are not identifying as male or female. I think that's the core difference. I think the rest of it actually still holds.
The only one change is the parenting youth count, the number of children in parenting youth households. So the youth tables might be trickier to use, but for the overall counts, it's certainly still a useful tool.
Yeah.
Okay, the next one is a bit of a loaded question, so it's coming at you, William. What is HUD's view about collecting Social Security numbers for clients during unsheltered survey?
That is a loaded question. So the point-in-time count, we get all sorts of sensitive information. When I say we, I definitely don't mean HUD. I mean you at the community level. Social Security, that's one where we would ask you to really consider whether it's needed. In the context of the PIT count, it probably is not needed. You can generally get enough information. It could be first and last, initials of first and last name with maybe a date of birth and a gender category. You could use those and create a deduplication factor that you can use across your various people. Most of that is not PII, right? The one piece there is the birth date, but having initials for first name and last name with race or gender is not personally identifiable information. So we would encourage you to minimize the PII you collect in the context of the PIT count, just because often you don't need it. You don't really need Social Security numbers in the context of the PIT count. There are very few instances I can think of where you may need it, but they generally go beyond counting and they go into services. So your service data collection is obviously going to be more enhanced, and there's a lot more there. So I would discourage the collection of Social Security numbers and other PII, limit it to the extent you can, so that you fulfill our reporting requirements and meet the whatever you need to de-identify, or deduplicate, I should be saying.
Okay. So the next question is about a best practice and suggestions on how to run a service-based count along with the night of the count.
There are a lot of fantastic models on this, and along with is kind of a loaded term because that could be at the same time, right? It's same date, or that could be along with in terms of as a companion piece that's covered over several days. There are a lot of communities, especially in the youth context, who are doing youth-specific events, and they're doing them at libraries, they're doing them at service providers' location that is common and well-known, they're doing them at other well-accepted locations, they're doing them on the night of the count, and they're essentially counting people as they come in. They ask some questions there, certainly fulfilling kind of the survey piece. So some are doing that, directly on the night of the count. I have a lot of communities where I've gone and counted where they've counted on the night of, and at that same time they're doing counting, they're either leaving a flyer or providing information about an event the next day where there's usually a meal. What we find is those events are fantastic because you've done the count, you've brought a lot of people in, but you've also created a forum where they can spread the word to other people who either just were not available or for whatever reason had decided they didn't want to be found on that night, but are willing to be, come in for a meal and have a discussion. That has been a really good mechanism that communities have used, and they generally find a few more people because you switch the setting and that's all the people needed to come in and be counted. And usually they ask, a low threshold set of questions at the service-based event if it's a meal. But they certainly ask, were you counted last night? And then if they weren't, then they'll do some follow-ups there. There are several other things that people do. More and more people are using by name lists. So that we're seeing while activities are done or service-based counts, they're kind of being targeted to subpopulations more and more, where communities otherwise are using something like the by name list to do work with their street outreach team to identify people that they hadn't otherwise found on the PIT count. So it's interesting that we're kind of morphing a little bit in what's happening in the PIT count because we're having more data collection happening, but we're recognizing gaps as well. So it's common to fill the gaps with the service-based count for subpopulations, youth in particular. Tracy and Megan, I'm sure you have some other thoughts about this or have seen some other things.
No, I thought you covered it well.
Okay.
Yep. And there, of course, the guidance that we'll point folks to on the next slide.
Yep.
Okay, the next one may be one that we ask you to submit into the HUD AAQ, but we should talk about it a little bit. And this question is to do with RHY BCP grants and HUD CoC TH funding. And so they have a project that receives RHY BCP, which, as you know, William, is categorized underneath the emergency shelter project type. And that project also receives HUD CoC TH funding. So the project states that they encourage blended funding such as this, but they don't know how to classify it. Is it ES or is it TH on the HIC?
That is a good question. So typically we count our BCP as emergency shelter. We likely would go there, but that is one I want you to submit. I should talk to some more of our reg experts before I make a final declaration here in the context of the call. So submit that, please, but I tell you the likely answer is going to be counting as emergency shelter.
Okay. So this person just wanted to verify if they have 100 individuals in hotels funded by FEMA or other funds, then we should add those 100 individuals in our PIT count under emergency shelter.
Yes, and make sure you designate, you hit that box that says natural disaster.
Okay, we have a lot of RRH questions. So hold your hats. Here we go. Rapid rehousing. Actively enrolled may prove to be a double count. If a client is in a bridge-type housing while waiting for move in RRH, but sheltered or housed in ESTH, is that okay?
Yes, I'm glad you raised that double counting issue. So you certainly should verify where people are. This is one of the reasons we have the move-in date requirement, though, right? The move-in date requirement, in theory, would prevent you from having somebody who is in, let's say, emergency shelter, who's enrolled in an RH program but in emergency shelter in the short term. It should, in theory, prevent you from counting them twice because that person is not currently moved in to the rapid rehousing project, even though they are enrolled or actively enrolled in the project. So we try to get at that, but there are going to be variations. Actually, the bridge housing one is a fun one where you may have to do some double checking to make sure you didn't double count anybody at the end of the day. And I would tell you, if you're not sure where to count somebody, if they are in a sheltered situation or transitional housing or the larger category of sheltered homelessness as well as permanent housing, you're likely going to default with the sheltered category unless you can somehow, within your own records, discover that they are not in that sheltered situation, right? Because generally it means that they're enrolled in some other program, but they're actually being housed in the context of that sheltered program. So it's going to require some digging, which you guys well know that's half the fun of the run after January 31st or whatever your PIT count date is, kind of running down all these scenarios. Tracy and Megan, is there more you would add to that?
Yeah, so I mean, really, the bottom line is don't double count. If you can prevent yourself from double counting, don't double count. So, if they're receiving services only, and they're not being served in another type of housing program that you're counting, then that's when you would include them under the services only category. But if they're in emergency shelter, they're in transitional housing, or some other program that you're already counting them, then you should count them where they're being sheltered at that point in time versus being in RRH. So only count them for services only if you're not counting them in another housing or sheltered location.
Yeah, good clarification. Yep.
Okay, another one about RRH. So the PIT count would include all households with an entry date, regardless of move-in date, or are we reporting two different PIT counts for each rapid rehousing? One for total enrolled, the other for total housed. I think we may have just clarified that.
Yeah, so essentially it's those who are move-in date. You're not otherwise counting them if they don't have both elements, both actively enrolled and with a move-in date. So, yep, you'll only count them, count rapid rehousing once for those who are in with a move-in date.
Okay, so let's go to youth counts. In terms of youth counts, local school districts have only been willing to provide a total number of students identified as homeless, citing privacy concerns when asked for additional details. Can this use be for extrapolation if they include doubled up?
Not if they include doubled up. Partly because the doubled up data, if you look at the national trend, is around 75% of the data or of the youth served in education programs are doubled up. So that would be a problem. What I would tell you is we are seeing that. We're glad. You should absolutely take what you get, right? And let them know you're grateful, right? This is that relationship building. When you publish your data, and I hope most, if not all of you, are publishing your PIT count data independently of what you submit to HUD, include that information. Include the education information. State what it is, right? State that this is what was reported by the schools. There are a lot of CoCs doing that now. That's a fantastic thing to do. It's good context anyways, but for the purposes of our count, if they can't provide you something that disaggregates the doubled up from the other categories, then you really shouldn't include it.
Yeah, William, let me just expand upon this a little bit and ask you a little bit of an intriguing question.
Yep.
The problem with collecting and counting youth counts that are given to you by the school district that you can't, how do I say this? You may already be counting that youth in the emergency shelter or your transitional housing projects. So you don't want to duplicate counts. What do you think? I mean, you wouldn't just take a youth count because they've got a whole bunch of other people in the household, and they may already be counted within your regular survey process.
Yeah, it's a huge challenge. Some of the communities that have dealt with this have used their de-identified data from the PIT count and actually worked with the school liaison, where the school liaison will look at the deduplication factor that's created, and they are willing to check it against their own information, which is actually really helpful because it gets past them sharing with you data that they may not have received permission to share. So working with the liaison is great. That's hard, right? Liaisons are really strapped, and often it's hard to get their interaction, even if they are very willing partners. They simply can't. That's one thing that's been done. Yeah, we've been going back and forth on how to deal with the education data. And most of the time, we're not able to get the granularity you need to make decisions. As long as you can somehow differentiate the youth from the data you already have, you should include them. That may mean that you don't get any of the demographic information. You may have to extrapolate to cover that. That's fine, right? We recognize we're just happy to get what we get sometimes. But if you really are don't have any way of knowing how to deduplicate, I would recommend going that route I mentioned at the beginning of the response of reporting it in a separate report, but giving it some boundaries, just saying this is what was given to us by our education liaison.
Okay, and I guess just to clarify a little bit more, there's a difference between counting youth who are under a certain age and those unaccompanied youth. You know, if there's a way the school district could identify for you which ones are unaccompanied, that might be helpful too.
That would be great, and they're supposed to be collecting that. We don't quite have that at the national level. We actually have it at the national level, but we don't get to see the granularity at the local level, but they're collecting it. So that's a good thing to ask them about unaccompanied youth.
Okay. We're running close to our deadline, so we'll get to as many questions as we can. If we don't get to all your questions, please submit them to the HUD AAQ. Let's see if we can find a quick one here. Will HUD be releasing what HUD considers PII for the purposes of PIT, BNL, or other sharing of client information?
I'm not sure I'm understanding the question. Tracy, what do you understand?
Yeah, I don't know that you have a specific documentation that you've released that says it's these particular data elements are considered PII. But, you know, from a general purposes, you know, PII information is anything that can be used to identify another person. So that's, you know, your social security number, your age, your date of birth, your gender, your race, your ethnicity, all that sort of identifying information would be considered PII.
But some of that doesn't, right? Some of the demographics get shielded under the technical definition of PII. So it's something we can look into providing more. That I can almost guarantee you won't happen by the next count. We'll look further into it, but there is a difference between sensitive information and PII. And PII usually, again, is very specific to the individual, right? Like a social security number is very specific to the individual. A birth date is very specific to the individual. So we'll look to see what we can do on that. Megan and Tracy, if you could help me remember, we can look at that further.
Okay. PII, writing it down. All right, here's an easy question. Is there any reason why a housing authority agency staff could not participate in the survey part of the PIT count?
No, we strongly encourage it. We have actually sent to our HUD staff that they can participate in the PIT count. We can't plan a PIT count. We can only participate as any citizen would in a volunteer context on the night of the count. If we can do that as HUD employees, PHA's staff can certainly do the same.
Okay, well, here's another easy one. We have a program that historically was a safe haven, but in the fiscal 2016 award, it was classified as PSH. How should this project be included in the PIT?
As a PSH, so not included in the PIT, only included on the housing inventory count as a PSH project.
Correct. All right. Here's another quick one. Were PIT report specifications given to vendors?
I don't think so.
No.
Yeah, we didn't give specs to that.
We have a lot of questions on PII, so yeah, we'll definitely take that one back. People are really asking for more guidance on it. Just to clarify, the survey templates on HUD Exchange will be updated before this year's count for us to download and use?
Yes.
Yes.
We're hoping to post next week, but we should note that there are very few changes, right? There's the addition of the gender category, and I believe the other one is the parenting youth piece will be clarified as well. But I think those are the only two changes from what was posted last year. Is that right, Megan?
That's absolutely right. They'll be ready by early next week.
Okay, let's turn our face back to youth, and this refers to the discussion about a group of youth siblings that present together where one is chronically homeless. According to RHY guidance, youth that present together are always counted as their own household as long as they are not parenting youth. So this is where we get into the difference between HHS and HUD for the purposes of the PIT.
Yeah, so remind me of Tracy, the first scenario, because there were children involved, and I thought that there were young children associated with, maybe I jumped the gun there, because we actually have worked with HHS and are generally in sync with them, so maybe I skipped over a detail that I shouldn't have.
So this refers to discussion about a group of youth siblings that present together where one is chronically homeless. So they're siblings. According to RHY guidance, youth that present together are always counted as their own household, as long as they're not parenting youth. I think it's the same thing. So if this household has one individual that was chronically homeless, then the whole household is considered chronically homeless.
Yeah, but their question is, are you actually reporting them as a household, right? So if you have three siblings, 16, 17, and 18-year-old, are you actually reporting them as one 16-year-old, one 17-year-old, and one 18-year-old? And then if you do that, you actually are not counting them all as chronically homeless because you're really counting them as individuals and only whoever it is.
That's right.
So I think earlier I misspoke. I, for some reason, imputed a parenting situation there. With the sibling category, you actually would treat them not as a single household. You would treat them as individuals, and the chronic status would only apply to the one that, well, it would apply to each uniquely, right, to the extent they meet the definition. So thank you for the follow-up there, because I jumped the gun then.
So then,
right, and that's related to the PIT versus RHY guidance. For RHY purposes, they count them as a household. For the PIT purposes, you count them as single individuals.
Right, yes, so there is a difference there, yeah.
So let's clarify. So for the 16 and 17-year-old, those two would be counted as individuals in households with only children, and each one of those would be considered chronically homeless. And
no,
then the 18...
They would not be chronically homeless, so that's the clarification here. They would only be chronically homeless based on their own status, right, if they meet it. If they're being reported individually as households with only children, but as individuals, right, because they're neither as parents. If they don't get reported as chronically homeless unless they uniquely meet the criteria of chronic.
Okay, so only the 18-year-old would be considered chronically homeless?
If the 18-year-old was the one who met the requirement, yes. Basically, you look at the 3 individuals individually, and did they meet the chronic status?
Okay, so we're at the end of our time, and William, if you want to wrap up with where people can go to get more information.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for asking great questions. Again, you see that some of these we don't give you great answers on because we're grappling with it as well. But that's part of the purpose for this call, is to deal with some of these nuts and bolts questions that are real, and we actually have to get to the bottom of it. So we appreciate that. There are certainly a lot of point and time count resources available. You can go to our website here, the PIT and HIC Guides, Tools, and Webinars page. This is the place where we will add the DV guidance. It will fall under the resources for counting specific populations. That's where you will find that. The PIT survey tools segment there, if you look on the left-hand bar, we'll have the extrapolation tool, among other things. And you know where to go, the AAQ, if you have questions.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, everyone, and Happy New Year.